oftentimes, or sometimes, those turn out to be fairly misleading indicators. So we can get back to that in a second. So picking up from point number one, which is that the candidates think that money is important, probably even though they shouldn't. We have a long history of trying to regulate money in national elections, federal elections. I'm not going to bother with state and local stuff because that's just too much of it to worry about. So starting in 1907, we have the Tillman Act, which gets corporations out of federal campaigns. This, by the way, is the thing that Citizens United most directly affected. Sort of sideways, but if you understand, if you think about the fact that Citizens United is aimed at a law from 1907, which never was challenged between 1907 and 2000, whatever it was, and it wasn't even challenged by name in Citizens United, it tells you something about where the court's thinking has gone on all of this. There's the Federal Corrupt Practices Act, which followed Teapot Dome, which is another big scandal in American history. There's the Taft-Hartley Act, which is when the Republican Congress gets into it and wants to try to do to labor what they feel is being done to corporations, yada yada. All of this sounds good, and none of this ever really worked in any significant way, mostly because there's never a dedicated enforcement agency. So we have laws on the books, but we don't have policemen for the laws. So what changes is Richard Nixon comes along. And Nixon, it's forgotten that in his effort to cheat while being really, really, really far ahead in the 1972 election, right? This is the part that's really sort of amazing about this. That is, it wasn't that Nixon was worried about winning, or that he should have reasonably worried about winning. He just cheated anyhow. So at any rate, part of the Watergate scandal revealed that there were these widespread campaign finance violations as part of the Committee to Re-elect the President, which was known as CREEP, go figure. And so this opened the door for Congress, as part of its sort of legislative response to Watergate, to pass the 1974 amendments to the Federal Election Campaign Act, which is essentially the governing law that we have today. And so I've got two slides on this. Here's the first of them. It does a bunch of things. It limited the amount of money that could be given to candidates. It contained the cost of campaigns. It provided public funding for some campaigns, restricted outside work groups, and it created the Federal Election Commission. So here's the same slide in a little bit more detail. So the goal here was to combat actual and perceived corruption. And we know this because this is in the actual congressional record at the time, that one of the reasons we wanted to pass this law is we wanted to fight the possibility of corruption before it happened, and we wanted to fight the appearance of corruption before it happened. It was important to maintain the integrity of the system. Secondly, the law recognized three types of actors who had formal legal requirements under the law: candidates, parties, and something called political action committees. I will get to political action committees soon enough. Individuals are there, they're actors as well, but they don't have any formal requirements under the law, so they're really sort of excused from this. So if you give money to any of these other things, the candidate or party political action committee, those people are responsible for essentially filing the paperwork and making certain that your contribution and you abide by the rules. It established candidate campaigns as the main spenders, and so pretty much all the money was routed through candidate campaigns committees. And this sets up the great First Amendment battle. I mean, a lot of things set up the First Amendment battle that takes place. But the idea here is, why are the candidates the only ones who can speak, essentially for themselves? Why can't I speak for the candidates? Which sounds completely stupid, and that is exactly what the argument is to this day when we talk about things like dark money, etc. And so the idea here is that on one hand, there is some genuine opposition from, civil libertarians and so forth, citing a 1960s era decision, I've forgotten the decision, about a group of anti-war objectors who lived on the Upper West Side of Manhattan and took out an ad in the New York Times protesting the war and calling on President Nixon to end the war. And the question was, is that a campaign contribution, or is that essentially unfettered political speech, right? And so you could certainly understand that you want to be in a position where you could say, I think, my president is good, bad, or indifferent, without triggering a bunch of other regulations. But the problem is that there has to be some sort of line which is drawn somewhere, or else there's no line drawn anywhere. And so the question here is, who do you want to be held accountable for what essentially the candidate is elected to do? So this leads to what I described here on this slide as the first, obviously poor choice. And what I mean by poor choice, I mean obviously a choice based on an unreal understanding of human nature made by the court. And I will get to this in exactly, I believe, 2 slides. And then finally, it created 2 types of actions. One is there were limits on some things, so I could only give a certain amount of money, but other things were actually restricted. So certain people couldn't do certain things. And there was public funding for presidential campaigns and for presidential nominating campaigns, but not for congressional campaigns. And you understand that this is Congress passing a law against the will of the president, who's weakened tremendously because of political events. So they have no desire to try to, provide public funding for their own campaigns. They see this as controversial, but they figure what the hell we can do to the president, and so they do. So what happens